Good morning, good morning, good morning. It is May 14th. It is 5:40 in the morning because I had just woken up because I kind of wake up in the morning. I'm more of a morning guy than I am a night guy these days. Just something that comes with age, I guess. Um, but I like to do this now, so I'm kind of like real fresh. My voice is all good, and I can get this done before I have to log into work. So at least I'm, keeping my duties separate from one another. An interesting note too is I'm kind of recording this one out of order. However, I'm not going to publish it until I do the last Edgar Rice Burroughs book, The Giant of Mars, just because I had these notes already written for me. So don't have to talk about that anymore. Let's move on. So this is The Skeleton Men of Jupiter from Edgar Rice Burroughs. Originally, this came out in Amazing Stories, published in February of 1943. So what they actually did in the publishing industry was they used to have these serials stories put over multiple issues or things like this that are just one issue. One story come out in one issue. With the popularity of Edgar Rice Burroughs in Amazing Stories, they actually put this story along with the other short story, John Carter and the Giant of Mars, together into one volume they published just called John Carter of Mars. Because interestingly enough, after 10 books, that was never the name of any of the stories. Starting with the first one was A Princess of Mars. And then you go into things like The Chessmen and A Fighting Man and Swords of and yada yada. So, I don't want to keep using that phrase. So, John Carter never had his own named book. But now they've done this with these two stories together. I think that book was published in July of 1964, probably about 20 years after the short story actually occurred in the Amazing Stories magazine. So, interesting little tidbit. Um, Now, I've been looking forward to finishing this story for months now. When I saw that I only had like three stories left in John Carter, and I would be kind of completed with his universe from what I started with, um, I started getting a little anxious, a little excited because I made a promise to myself that when I was finished recording the John Carters, that I would try to go back to auditioning for Audible and try to get some paid work of doing this voice stuff. So, wish me luck. Hopefully, it works out pretty well. Um, I'd done it twice before. Each time I probably did about like 20 auditions, and half of them would get back to me saying, no, thank you. The other half just wouldn't respond. So it was left out into the ether. So I want to get back into that. And I know all this has nothing to do with this story per se, so let me not take up any more of your time and hop right into it. So, this one starts out interestingly enough. Um, John Carter is enjoying his life on helium with his incomparable Deja and some guy comes over who's in the military, says, hey, Jedek wants to go speak with you. And by the way, I got like a two-man air car over here. I'll take you to him. He goes, no problem. No reason to think anything was going on. But it turns out he captures him. And the reason why he captures him is literally to take him to Jupiter. Or what they call on Mars, which is Barsoom, they call Jupiter Sassoon. So, what then happens is a lot of elaborate science fiction details. It goes back to the old fashioned stories where it was always a world of wonder, and the author had the imaginations to let them know, hey, you know something? We're going through the stars now. Let me show you what it's like to be inside of a spaceship so you can be a part of the story yourself. And we'll look through viewports and check out the cosmos and see the stars and the planets and the moons whizzing by at amazing speeds. At the same time, let me put, my thoughts to paper, and I'm going to describe to you how a ship can actually drive through space. So this is all put down into elaborate detail for the reader to understand and just become part of the journey. Okay? There's even a whole section in this journey after John Carter is abducted and going to Jupiter where he has to learn the language of Sassoon. Which, by the way, the people of Jupiter call Eurobus, and Mars being Garibus. So with the language too, he gets to interact more with some of the people who have captured him. One of the things that he does realize that these skeleton warriors they're talking about, that's what most of the people on Jupiter look like. And these are actually called Morgors. So he's sitting there, and some of these skeletons are teaching him the language of Eurobus, and it adds that other element to a story saying, like, yeah, you don't want to just go from this world to that world, and now you speak the language, because they speak English, or whatever you want to think they are. So it adds the nice complexity of saying, listen, I'm going to put you through this grueling tutorial of the language, and when you get there, you'll be fluent, and you can talk to, the Jedak, the guards, other prisoners, what have you. So, they finally get to Jupiter, and again, with the storytelling, great details in describing the planet. I mean, if you're on the John Carter track of reading Edgar Rice Burroughs books, then you don't know what the other planets are like. And I know he has Jupiter stories and he has Venus stories, I think, so it's each one can have its own unique way, but he's already introduced you to Mars, and we've known that planet for many stories so far. So now we're trying to find out what's going on in Jupiter. And there's an interesting section where it might even be in the forward when he talks about not liking forwards, where he's saying, listen, scientists think that Jupiter is like this and it's uninhabitable and it's too hot, and if you went there the gravity would just crush you on its own weight and that kind of thing. But he's trying to tell a story, so you get to see how he describes it and how it is hospitable to people living. And basically what he's talking about is that what we see of Jupiter with the great clouds and it's spinning really rapidly, it's basically just the atmosphere, but the upper atmosphere. And they talk about, Jupiter's like Earth and maybe even Mars. It's got, land, it's got forests, it's got mountains. In fact, they've got volcanoes that are erupting constantly, which are casting a red glow inside the planet, or inside the envelope of the clouds, they call it. It even has seas and oceans. So it's a regular planet that's essentially covered by a gaseous upper atmosphere. And the reason how he writes it in there saying, because Jupiter spins so fast, say about 3 times as fast as Earth spins, even though it's so large, that it almost propels those gases outwards to the upper atmosphere. And that causes this cloud envelope of just containing the atmosphere underneath. And that envelope almost acts a little bit like a greenhouse, where it keeps the entire planet almost like one nice temperature. It's got the heat from all these volcanoes exploding, which go up in the atmosphere, but then all like the, say, ash and soot or even gases coming out from, the core are propelled outwards enough that it doesn't affect the people on the surface. So I think it's kind of interesting. I like how he wrote this down there. He even says, too, because of the fact that there's, this cloud envelope and volcanoes are constantly erupting, that everything has like a reddish or pinkish tint to it. So even him being the white man from Earth, he's been on Mars for a while and he hangs out with red men and he considers himself a red man. When he's there, he looks a little bit more red. Although there is another red man who had kidnapped him and he looks even darker red. So there is a difference in their actual skin tones. Another interesting thing too is because there's a huge thick cloud layer, nobody who lives on Jupiter has ever seen the stars. They haven't seen the fact that they have so many moons surrounding the planet. They don't know that other planets really exist because they can't see anything. They can't explore. There's no telescopes to show what's on the other side of the clouds. Okay? And this is all well and good for any lover of science fiction. And, sorry. It's always interesting to see how people will write their way out of a situation. You know, it's taking the fiction part as far as you can go and be believable from where the fact is. Because the fact is, and unfortunately, like anything else, the fact is going to be what we've heard scientists say. And scientists have said, oh yeah, we've kind of measured the temperature and the atmosphere and yada yada of, is that word again, of Jupiter, and you couldn't go there. Once you got close enough, the gravity would just pull you down and our bodies would just get sucked to the ground. You couldn't even get up. So you would die there shortly. So this is how Edgar Rice Burroughs says, well, that may be so, but I need to have people there and they got to fight and they've got to have a society. So let me do this. Okay. I know there's, who's that guy? There's that famous astrophysicist, the black dude with the mustache. I forget his name off the top of my head. I'm sure I'll find it later on. Maybe I'll type it across the screen. But he watches science fiction and he enjoys it. But every time he sees something, he'll like tweet about it, saying like, yeah, that would never happen. You know, and the reason why that would never happen is this thing here. So, and then people usually like don't like when he does that. They're like, oh, you're ruining for everybody, this, that, and the other. But it reminds me of two things about that too. I remember back when I was younger, Mystery Science Theater 3000 had come out, where they had this little storyline where people have to watch old movies because they're almost like prisoners on this ship. And in the opening title, they talk about, like, you know, if you're wondering how he eats or drinks or any other science facts, just repeat to yourself, hey, it's just a show. I just sit back and relax. So, watching these people, you know, write fiction out of fact is great. Austin Powers, I think, did the same thing, where he's doing Goldmember, and he's in the car, and he's going to go back to 1965, and he's like, wait a minute, Basil, if I was frozen in 1969, if I go back to 1967, I might be able to run into myself, but how can I do that if I'm getting thought out later on, and oh no, I've gone cross-eyed, and he tries to think about the paradox. And then this Basil Exposition, which is a great name to have that character being Exposition, says, I just want you to go back there and enjoy yourself. And then they break the fourth wall, look at the camera. And that goes for you too. So it doesn't matter if Jupiter wouldn't sustain life. Edgar Rice Burroughs is saying it can. So let's enjoy the story there and move on. Neil deGrasse Tyson. That's the gentleman's name. He's the guy. I knew it would come to me eventually. So, other than that, I've now recorded everything for this book. And after doing all the John Carters, I started with book 6 because it was the first one coming into the public domain in the U.S. And a lot of people have done like the first book, Princess of Mars, and maybe even the second two. But no one really had this one out there, except for on YouTube. There's a person who does a computer-voiced reading of these stories. And obviously, when you try to listen to that while you are getting the story, maybe if you were sight impaired, whatever, and this would actually give you a story to listen to, it just doesn't sound natural. It doesn't have a voice that actually uses good pronunciations and proper inflections. So I had noticed that a lot of these other John Carter stories were not available in audiobook form, so I wanted to do myself, I wanted to do you a service, actually, and get it out there while practicing how to do speaking myself. But after doing book 6 through now what I'll call book 11, I was getting what I've talked to about before is a little John Carter fatigue. And the thing was that some of the stories do have very similar things in it, And this story has all the earmarks of a John Carter story as it is, and they even include other stories in where they have like characters show up in other John Carter things too. So it's like even when John Carter's not playing a major role, he has Ulysses Paxton coming through, or even Tan Hadron of Hastor has his own book. They go through the similar trials and adventures. So it was one of those things where it's like, okay, I need to diversify a little bit more. And like other John Carter stories with this one, he's taken to the Jedak when he finally gets to Jupiter. They have their words. He's thrown into the dungeon, or in other books, he's thrown into the pits. Makes friends while he's a prisoner, comes back to the Jedak, goes in a different dungeon, makes even more friends, and eventually comes to the point where he has to compete in the arena, which is usually competing in the games or whatever else in the other stories as well. Although this story is pretty interesting too, in a way, because this time when he goes to the arena, it's not just like, hey, we like our slaves to fight every now and again. Let's hoorah who has the best slaves. Which almost goes to how the Spartacus show, I think it was on Showtime, was like. And I'll tell you what, if you ever want something good, watch the Spartacus show and even watch the prequel, which was kind of like season 2. I know they had a problem because the main lead had, I want to say non-Hodgkin's lymphoma or Lou Gehrig's disease or something like that. So they couldn't film the second season when they wanted to originally. So they said, listen, let's do a prequel season. We'll give the viewers something to watch, and then we'll come back when we finally can. And unfortunately, that main actor had died. They had to recast him, and the show went on, but it wasn't quite the same. That original guy was pretty good. I'm just writing a note here to put a little photo up here saying Spartacus. Bingo. Okay, sorry about that. Now, but in this one here, instead of fighting for who has the best slaves and who's the best house, they actually use this arena to be the graduating class of warriors coming out of the military academy fight in the arena, and if they win, they actually graduate into the warrior caste, which is pretty much all the people that on Jupiter do. These Morgors, they call them, like these skeleton men here, they just fight, and they're conquering things constantly. So now, you almost get a little bit of that, the Gladiator movie. Where Russell Crowe and the team is like, okay, we are slaves, we're coming out there, and we're going to fight. But this time, instead of just for the entertainment of the crowd, it's for the graduating class to get experience when they come out. What else happens in this story? Well, of course, at one point, they gotta go get Dejah Thoris and bring her to Jupiter, too, because what's going on is the main purpose of everything is the main Jedak of the Morgors on Erebus. His men have conquered almost all of Jupiter. They're just a conquering nation. So the thing is, they've conquered Jupiter, now they want more. What else can they do? Oh, let's go to another planet. Let's go to, they call it Garibus, but let's go to Mars and let's conquer them. And you know something? Helium seems to be the most advanced and most powerful nation on Mars. So let's conquer them, and then the rest just fall like dominoes. Okay. But if I want to bring in that fatigue a little bit, it's funny. Although these people have conquered all of Jupiter, there's one small island they can't conquer for some reason. Of course, that's going to be like the little Shangri-La where people can escape to and make sure they're never slaves again. And oh, by the way, there's a bunch of areas of Jupiter that the Morgos have never even, explored. And they talk about that when John Carter gets maps trying to find his way from one location to another. And they say, oh yeah, largely uninhabited territory. Even the Morgos haven't seen it yet. So it's one of those things where it's like they've conquered everything except that and except that. But now they've got to go to another planet to continue. Yeah. Take it for what it is. Okay. Boom, 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 boom. So, dungeon, Jeddak, talking, dungeon, Deja. Oh my god. Gotta save her. And obviously things end up pretty well. There's an interesting section where, like, the escape and the rescue is going on there. It sounded a little bit like another one of the books too, where it's like, let's get a flying craft, let's go up in the tower, jump in through a window, and try to get people off, whatever else. So, I mean, every time he does it, pardon me, it's interesting to see. It's good to read. There's battles, there's fighting and everything else. But you always see there's a little tinge of, this sounds a little familiar. I think I might have seen this before. And then after the escape and everything else, now he's got to get from, to that little island. That's where we're going to send all the people and we'll be happily ever after on Jupiter. And it's funny because you've got to go through a whole chapter of, like, the odyssey of him escaping what he does. First we have to go here, and then we have to go through the forest, then we have to go over the mountains and whatever else. And it's funny, they even mentioned that as a line. I wrote it down here, where it's like, he physically says in the beginning of a chapter, I shall not bore you with an account of that part of my odyssey, which finally brought me to one of the cities of Hondu's country. But then he goes on and bores you a little bit with the odyssey of how he gets to the country. And then, unfortunately, the story just ends. It's like, I'll look at Wiki, someone had put this out there, and they said, okay, in the John Carter book itself, the two books, The Giant of Mars and Skeleton Men of Jupiter, it says here, the second story, Skeleton Men of Jupiter, was first published in Amazing Stories in 1943. Intended as the first in a series of novelettes, to later be collected in book form, just like Lana of Gothal was done. Lana of Gothal, of course, being 4 stories over 4 issues, made one large volume. This story ends with the plot unresolved, and the intended sequels were never written. And then they say that several other writers have written pastiche endings to the story. Unfortunately, there's no citation on the wiki thing for who's done that, where can I read them, whatever else, so maybe I'll have to, go search for them one day and see what I can find out there. But it literally just is unfinished. And, I finished reading this and recording it. I finished editing and dropping this on Mother's Day this year. He finally escapes to where he's getting to, reunited with Deja Thoris. The end. And I'm like, yay, they have a reunion, which you never thought was not going to happen. I'd love to see George R.R. Martin get his whole hand on this stuff, where Deja might be killed in the second book. But the first thing in my mind is like, okay, you've found the princess, you've helped her escape, and now you've reunited. What about the whole, they're sending an invasion fleet to Barsoom? There's so much of this story that is not being talked about at this moment. Yeah, you got your girl back, and that's all fine and dandy, and, maybe when the screen ends and it goes to black, it's like the heart comes down on the two kissing on their reuniting, as everything says the end in the background, but you're not even close to being the end. So it's actually one of the reasons why I was a big fan of that movie, Master and Commander, Far Side of the World. Okay, and it turns out that it was made of 2 or 3 parts of stories from Patrick O'Brien, and he had the captain and his doctor, which is Aubrey and Maturin. They do these adventures over the course of like 20 books. Okay, and I have them all, and they're back behind the junk there somewhere, but I've got all the books there because the movie was so fantastic to me that I wanted to read the stories. So I read all 20 stories and was happy doing that too, because they are pretty episodic in a way that, while they build on one another, there's no like, oh, and this is the Death Star we have to blow up at the end. So it's like, okay, let's go through all the stories and like it. There's a 21st book that has come out, okay, and it's literally called The Unfinished Voyage of Jack Aubrey. Okay, the problem is it's a literal unfinished book. So I think like the first few chapters are in normal like pages in book form, and then the next few chapters are like handwritten notes that they've copied down so you can see where his mind was going with the story, but then he never finished it. So it's literally an unfinished voyage, and I literally do not want to read a story that's unfinished. Especially when I know it's unfinished in the beginning. I didn't know Men of Jupiter. I didn't do any research to see it was going to just stop. So, like, even like the Aubrey Maturin, I did not want to start it not knowing how it's going to end. In fact, it's one of the major reasons why I have not read George R.R. Martin's, A Song of Ice and Fire, because he takes forever to get to the next book. After 40 years of writing books, he's become an overnight sensation. And with the Game of Thrones show being so popular, everyone saw how all of a sudden the show outpaced the books and went to its own ending, which is practically done with TV writers instead of, screenplay writers. And people abhorred it. Now, those books are tomes. And I have no problem reading a thick book. But I'm not going to read 7 books in a series and unfortunately maybe have him die because he never finished the damn thing. And I know with his overnight success after 40 years of writing, he's doing like prequel books, and this one takes place right before the first one, and this one takes place 1,000 years before the last one, and whatever else, and they're making TV shows about that, which he's into. I mean, he's really enjoying his success right now. So to finish out this one story just because people like the TV show, it's not driving him too much. So unfinished stories have an unsatisfying feeling to a reader like me. So I was still enthusiastic about reading it. I was still enthusiastic about talking about it in a way, but like I said, it had a lot of just John Carter in a cell talking to people, and there wasn't the kind of adventure that you would get in the other stories. Like even, Lana of Gothal, while it did end up being serialized over 4, was like, boom, they went to different areas and gotten different adventures. And maybe this would have gotten there had it been written. But even if you jump back to the last story, The Giant of Mars, that was a short story that it was 75 pages, and it went to like 3 or 4 different areas. And each one they had to build, even when he goes to like the underground city with the rats, it really brought you along on a short adventure of, what's this behind the walls? Something's coming towards me. I gotta fight him. Brings me down. There's a rat king. They're doing a ritual. What is going on here? This is interesting and amazing. Unfortunately, I don't think the story ever got there. Not to mention, it didn't have very many change of sceneries and locations to bring you along that the other ones did too. So I feel it was paying a lot of justice to those lovers of science fiction that like to see details of worlds they've never seen before. And it did an excellent job of that. But, you know, it just, those details, while they can be fascinating for some readers, might not be interesting and page turners for others. I've got an example here I want to talk about too. So it's it's something I've learned recently where I said history. Okay, history can be very interesting, but history sometimes is not entertaining. Okay, last year Disney Plus came out with the Miss Marvel show. Okay, and at this point, people like, in fact, they love to talk about Marvel fatigue and superhero fatigue. Me, I'm like, I love stories. You're gonna show me a new character? Show me a new character. When I read comic books 25 years ago, this wasn't a character, and I've kind of heard about her. This Miss Marvel stars the woman named Iman Vellani, who happens to be a Pakistani woman. And she's playing a Muslim Pakistani American of Miss Marvel. And during the story arc, in one of the episodes, they do what I believe is called the India-Pakistani partition. Okay? Apparently this is a very important piece of history that happened to these people. I was not aware of this. It never came up in my history classes, which I am aware almost sounds very like Anglo-centric of the history I learned versus the history of the world. But, one of the things I can say is that in my history classes going through like grade school and high school, chronologically, and granted this is in the 80s, we brushed upon World War II, and we almost never got to Vietnam War, which was in our books. Okay, so we hit maybe 1943, or maybe early 30s or something like that. So when this partition occurred, it was about circa 1947. We wouldn't have gotten to it anyway, because it was the end of the semester. They just didn't get into that recent history of the last 40 years. We're too busy talking about things that happened much, much earlier than that. So, anywho, which typically is a word I hate. I just used it intentionally because it gave me a throwback to Mallory Archer. But with this India-Pakistan partition, I'll take this thing from an NBC article. It says, pardon me, India's departing British colonial rulers drew borders roughly along religious lines, and it created a Hindu-majority India and a Muslim-majority Pakistan. And the result ended up being a mass migration of at least 12 million people had to go between the two countries to be their ethnic or religious separated areas. And while this is going on, there's ethnic and religious violence that killed as many as 2 million people. So, I haven't read about this more. I probably will eventually one day. But it's one of those things where it's like, did this really happen? Let me understand more of this so I can see, some bad stuff that actually happened in history. It's an interesting item of world history, especially when you're talking about that area of the globe, and especially today with what's going on in that area of the globe. And it's most likely a very horrible and a tragic event. Okay? And we should probably learn more about it so we can understand other cultures in a certain way. However, as interesting as it is, it's not entertaining. If you want to read the story to learn about it, like I might do in the future, say, what is this partition? I'll get details. I'll probably get pictures. I might not like to see the pictures, but we'll see what happens. And the character depictions of what happened to these people would probably move you to tears. But it's one of those things where I say, something? Keep in mind, if one day you want to go watch Schindler's List, and even want to do it on a Friday night, you don't watch Schindler's List to be entertained. You watch it to be moved. You wanted to see a piece of history because the person actually did exist and they actually did this. Okay? But is it entertaining? I personally don't think so. I mean, hell, you want to go watch Requiem for a Dream by Aaron Aronofsky. You don't watch to be entertained. You watch to see a drug-addled and examples of other things that happen to people in a fictional sense. But then what usually happens is you watch that movie and you swear you'll never watch it again. I do recommend it, by the way. I recommend both of those movies, but, there's never a second viewing for the most part. So I think I've said what I wanted to say. I'm not trying to be disparaging on this story, but, you're along the ride for John Carter to begin with, so you definitely jump into this. And you will get a story, and you will see all the amazing feats and how he makes friends and how he deals with enemies and everything else. Just understand, though, unfortunately, that when you go through it, it's going to have an ending, but it's not the ending. It's like if you're watching the Fellowship of the Rings movie, you'll get to the end of it, but yeah, the whole saga of the ring has not completed yet. There's a hell of a lot more to go. So, on that note, let me leave you. Here it is at a little bit less than 40 minutes right now. I hope you've, taken something out of what I said here today. Hopefully this assists you in either making up your mind to read or not read, or like I said, and I love to say too, if you don't want to read it, you can listen to it. I have the audiobook out there, and it's not very long either. So I think it's about 3 hours long, give or take, without looking at it behind the screen. So, as always, enjoy, happy reading. I'll see you here again shortly enough, because I have more reviews to do, due to the fact that I've actually gotten a lot of reading done recently. All right. Take care. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.